True Crime South Africa is published in conjunction with Arena Holdings, publishers of Times Live, Business Live, Sowetan Live, and others. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of Arena Holdings and its affiliates.
This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to my interview with Ronel Koekemoer, Counselling Coordinator for the Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to thank our new supporters for the week. A huge thank you goes out to Chantal Roberts, Ashley Mendoza, and Melissa Barnard for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, everyone. It really does make a huge difference. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon or PayPal, I'll leave a link in the show notes. If you like discounts, who doesn't? Head over to King Online for your health and beauty needs, or Print Crowd for all your printing requirements, and use the code TCSA10 at checkout for a 10% discount, and support the show at the same time. Other forms of support that make a huge difference include following the show on social media, inviting your friends, family, postman, hairdresser, and parole officer to listen, and leaving reviews on the podcast platform you use to listen. True Crime South Africa is, of course, my main podcast baby, but I've also hosted the Devil's Dorp Companion podcast, and in 2022, you could possibly see some more podcasts popping into your feed from me. You can also follow my Facebook page to get updates on those new projects. Up front, I would like to thank Eskom for being an absolute pain in the butt and scheduling their load shedding smack bang in the middle of this interview. Not to be deterred though, I used mobile data to record, which, while not producing the best sound quality I've ever had, still did do the job. So an A+ to Vodacom for supplying decent signal during load shedding, and an F as well as a U thrown in for Eskom's non-existent service. Rape and sexual violence is rampant in our country, and it is significantly underreported. Perhaps more importantly, as a base point, it is significantly misunderstood. The concepts of rape, sexual violence, consent, and surviving these acts being perpetrated upon you are cloaked in myth and too often shame and self-doubt. And then we add in the fact that we have a significant gap in the available psychosocial services in our country, and fighting the scourge of sexual violence seems like a losing battle. But it's not really, because there are organizations in our country that are working to stem the tide, provide survivors with support, and educate. One such organization is the Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust. I had the pleasure of chatting with Ronel Koekemoer, who is the counselling coordinator for the organization. When I interview people, I try not to be too structured about it. The question and answer thing is really limiting in my opinion. So I really just want to have a conversation about the issues at hand and whatever comes up. And I think that worked really well with Ronel, because we chatted about the services that the organization offers, but I think we also delved into some really important discussions, and I'm excited to share this with you. A trigger warning, of course, this interview does involve discussion of rape and sexual violence, which may be triggering to some listeners. We also use actual names of body parts, like vagina, penis, and anus, because, well, that's what they're called. And we say words like penetration, erection, lubrication, and even the F word, all in the context of the discussion we're having. So maybe not the episode to listen to in your car while going through the drive-thru. So let's get into my interview with Ronel Koekemoer of Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
My name is Ronel Koekemoer, and I am currently the counselling coordinator at an organisation called Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust. So we're based in Cape Town, but we do work all over the country, and we run a 24-hour helpline service that we get calls from anywhere and everywhere. The organization's sort of been in place, I think, since the middle of the 70s. So we've got quite a long history, but we deal with basically rape and sexual violence only. So, you get a lot of organizations dealing with gender-based violence more broadly, but Rape Crisis's expertise is very much around sexual violence. And we have a bunch of different projects. So we have an advocacy team who focus on things like systematic change in the courts or the hospitals or the police. We have a making change team who go into schools or communities and give talks on rape myths and things like that. And then we have sort of like a court division, court support, and they sort of walk the criminal justice trial journey with the rape survivors if they're going through the court process. And then we have counseling, the counseling service, which is what I sort of run and manage, is we counsel rape survivors or sexual violence survivors, and it's a free, all of these services are free as well, which is quite amazing. But the counseling model is very much around crisis counseling, trauma counseling, but it's entirely up to the survivor. And we recruit volunteers within the community themselves that we work in and train them as lay counselors as well. So it's a lot more sort of grassroots, as opposed to maybe a more professional model of counseling or psychosocial support. I know I'm biased, but I think the counseling is the sort of the beauty of the organization, because it's very, very hard to get access to psychosocial services, affordable psychosocial services and trauma counseling in South Africa, I think anyway, but also because, sexual violence is very unique and the trauma of sexual violence is unique. And so it's great to be able to extend that expertise into sort of psychological interventions. But what's also really cool is that in the counseling room, we see a bit of everything. So we see the legal process, we see the police process, we see the perpetrator, we see the criminological aspects of the perpetrator, we see the victim sort of thing. Like, you really get a full picture of sexual violence in the counseling room as well. So like I said, I am biased, but I think that counseling is very uniquely placed in that way.
So this is very clearly a hugely vital service. All of the aspects that Ronel touched on here are so important for survivors of sexual violence to have access to. But I think most important is the counselling portion. Because we know psychologists and psychiatrists are expensive. And of course I understand why they are, but let's face it, they are pretty much outside of the affordability scope of most people in this country.
I think a big part of it as well, which is why I think Rape Crisis is very important, is that we're like a good starting point. So if you've been through rape 20 years ago, if you were raped yesterday, you can rock up at the office or call us on the helpline and say, what do I do now? So we can funnel people in the sort of best direction, which I think is helpful, because a lot of people don't know where to start. And I mean, when you're working with trauma as well, the people have so many things going on, and there's so many voices in their head saying, no one's going to believe you, or the police are incompetent, or, I'm not a good rape survivor, or whatever. So it's a good place to start, and to sort of be like, we are here, come as you are, and like, we will see what you need. And if it is psychiatric intervention, then we'll go that way. If it's about reporting, we'll go that way. I wish there were more services like this, definitely.
And I think that's an excellent way to describe what Rape Crisis does. I see it as a sort of trauma triage process. At a point in a survivor's life where they might really have no idea where to go next, Ronel and her colleagues offer guidance and resources. Although I'm well aware that Rape Crisis is not the only organisation of this type, it is an organisation that runs on donations. and they can only provide as many resources as their funds allow. I asked Ronel whether she felt that the organisation was stretched as far as resources are concerned, considering the massive problem we have with rape and sexual violence in this country.
Definitely. Let me put it this way, I think Rape Crisis's work has we've only gotten bigger, right? We've had to struggle through, there was a financial crisis at one stage, and the need for the service is there, but funding and things like that is always a bit of a hurdle and a battle. But also, there's many different people in the game. So people want, they want funding for their territory maybe. And so it is also, in that sense, you've got to play that game as well. And luckily there are much more qualified people than me to deal with that side of it. But what I will say is just in February, they were reporting on the crime stats that there was a decline in the number of rapes reported. And in my sort of 6 years of working at Rape Crisis, we've never been busier in the month of February seeing counseling survivors. So as much as those stats are out there from the police side or from the CJ, the criminal justice system side, we've never been busier. There's a huge demand for these services.
This is why I'm always so cautious about stats. Because firstly, we know that the number of reported rapes does not equate to the number of actual rapes. Survivors do not always report for various reasons. And the second reason I tend to only take a cursory interest in statistics is because the people on the ground are telling a very different story. I wondered how many of the survivors that come through the doors of Rape Crisis actually go through with reporting their crimes to the police. Now, I sprung this question on Ronel, but her answer actually says quite a lot, I think.
I can't give you a hard number, but what I will say is at least 50% of our counseling people have tried in some way. So it might not be a full trial, but they've opened a case, or they've accessed forensic services in some way, or they've, gone to police station or something. So, it's not that survivors are completely not wanting to go that direction, but I think there is a lot of mistrust and apprehension. So they definitely sort of, if I can say, they flirt with the criminal justice system in a certain way. But I wouldn't say everybody goes through to reporting or to keeping a case going. And I think that's a big misconception as well, is that, rape trials take years. You don't report on Friday and, by next week, the person is in jail. It's a long uphill battle. So it's quite, you have a lot of survivors that withdraw because, it's hard, it's harsh on you. But I know our court support team are also very busy. So, there are survivors in the system and they are accessing the criminal justice.
Just so that we're all on the same page, and because I know that there is a very clear societal idea about what rape and sexual violence means, I asked Ronel to provide her definition of rape as it pertains to survivors.
And I will say this, it's a tricky one because a lot of the times we do get more and more people phoning saying, this happened to me, does this count as rape? Or would you say I was raped? And that's a difficult one because you don't want to give somebody a label that might not be helpful for them. So it's a lot up to the person as well about what does being raped or what does being a rape survivor mean to you in certain things, because you have the stereotype of rape as very violent, stranger danger situation, but it's so much more complicated than that. And the law actually does recognize that, where rape is sort of it's a violent crime where the perpetrator uses sexual acts or to perform sexual acts to intentionally harm or hurt another person. And it's really a weaponization of sex and sexuality in all its social meanings, religious, moral, all of those meanings. in order to terrorize, dehumanize, humiliate the other person. And like I said, I think there is a stereotype about rape looking a very specific way. But I think what people need to realize is that sexual violence is not a hierarchy, it's a spectrum. Like there's so many different things that it can look like. It could be your husband, it could be, a female partner. It might not be a penis in a vagina necessarily, but it could be, fingers in someone's mouth or someone's anus or something like that. So it's complicated to pin down, but what I will say is that the law recognizes that it's penetration in an orifice of a sexual nature. So it can be, like I said, fingers in an anus or someone putting their penis in someone else's mouth. That counts as rape. And that's actually quite, well, in South Africa's history, that's recent. That's since 2007. Before then, sort of the apartheid era law said, rape is a man using his penis to penetrate a woman's vagina. And it also said, a husband can't rape his wife. It's not recognized as a crime. So there was no sort of room made for male survivors of sexual violence or rape. If you were a man, you couldn't be raped according to the old law. Whereas now it's a lot more gender neutral. It's a lot more inclusive. And also consent is understood in a very different way in the current law, which I think, you said in your email is coercive circumstances. The law tries to take that into account now, is that consent is not, just you saying no. It's got a lot to do as well with, is the person giving consent to the specific act, the sexual act that's happening? Are they giving consent to, enthusiastically? Are they compos mentis to give consent? So even in the law, if you're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, it's not necessarily seen as you giving consent. You're not sort of seen as being able to give consent. And obviously that's all lovely on paper, but rape and sexual violence have very social meanings as well. And I think that's where the tension is coming in a lot of the time.
So a few things for us to unpack there. Firstly, can we all please collectively just take a moment to feel complete nausea that South African law used to say that rape cannot occur between spouses? Secondly, can we please thank our lucky stars that this and so many other aspects of our rape and sexual violence laws actually changed? Just one quick example that I was thinking of when Ronel was talking about this is the Nicholas Nino case. You'll likely remember this as the so-called Dross child rapist case, in which Nino was convicted of raping a 7-year-old child in a toilet in a Dross restaurant in Silverton. This case is actually a prime example of how the new South African laws around rape and sexual violence work to serve survivors. Because Nino did not actually penetrate the child with his penis. He digitally raped her. So if we were back in the day, he would have been found guilty of a far lesser crime, and he would have been back out on the streets in a short space of time. So if you think that the wording of legal terms and policies is unimportant, think again. It has real-life consequences. The other thing that Ronel started to touch on here is consent. And I'd specifically mentioned to her that I wanted to discuss consent under coercion, because more and more this has been something I've been thinking about. And just consent in general. I know so many people think it's a confusing term, but really, it's not. Here's what Ronel had to say.
Sure. So, consent, the way that we try to conceptualize it is, firstly, it's ongoing. So, it's a process. It's not just, I said yes 5 minutes ago, so I'm still saying yes now. But the other very important thing is it's enthusiastic, which is that, the person really wants to have sex or wants to do the sexual acts or whatever, and is excited for that and, is happy to be engaged in that. And if you're not enthusiastic about the sex you're having, then you need to sort of you need to take a step back. And if your partner's not enthusiastic about what you're doing to them, you need to think about, does this count as consent? And it's also specific, like I said, just, consent to, giving someone a blowjob is not consent to penetrative sex or, things like that. And I think, and there's this real idea of like consent in relationships is implied, or it's not sexy to talk about these things. But I think the reality is also that a lot of, couples or a lot of people have been having very healthy, happy, consensual sex for years, and the difference, So there is this sort of idea that, consent is this elusive concept that people often get wrong and they make accidentally, but it is much more, I think it's much more natural than rape is, if I can put it that way, in a lot of ways. I mean, you can tell the difference between a comfortable and an uncomfortable sexual experience. And I think, that's one of the big things as well that we say to survivors who ask us the question, like, does this count as rape or sexual violence? Is, if you're still feeling unsure and uncomfortable about something that happened to you, that's valid. There's a reason you feel that way. And it might not mean it was rape, but don't think you're crazy or that you're overreacting. There's a reason that doesn't sit well with you, or that encounter still, haunts you or plagues you long afterwards, I think, as well. So consent, I think, is less of a mythical concept than we sometimes think. So I would say, like, it boils down to that it's enthusiastic, it's specific to the act itself, it's ongoing, and importantly, it can also be taken away at any time. So you can say, actually, I thought I was comfortable with this, but I'm not really. And yeah, so that's what I would sort of sum up as being consent.
Ronel raises a seriously important issue here, and that is consent within relationships, and that it is not implied. The society and even the country we live in is still very much based on so-called old-fashioned ideals. And part of that is often that when you enter into a relationship, your body now belongs to the marriage or partnership, and that sex is somehow a duty of being someone's romantic partner. And this is a touchy issue, because it's not just a legal consideration, it's an emotional one. It's often even a religious one. It's an idea that's passed down from generation to generation. But it's something we need to start thinking about and talking about, because it very often plays a role in another major scourge we talk about, which is domestic violence. And having consent taken away from you within a relationship doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like doing something to avoid an argument, or doing something because you were promised something which doesn't materialize. It can be as simple as consenting to a specific act that you actually don't want to do because the other person might sulk. You're not making that choice out of your free will because there is a condition attached to it. Ronel also wanted to clarify, though, that sexual violence or the issue of consent within relationships is a very personal issue.
I'm realizing now as well that a lot of the things that I think in this line of work that we take for granted are actually things that people maybe, haven't really hashed out for themselves or their relationships yet. So on the one hand, I want to say trust your gut. Like if you're still feeling uncomfortable about something that happened, then maybe you do need some support around that. It might not be accusing someone of rape, but it's definitely maybe worth chatting to someone about, or speaking to your partner about it and saying, that wasn't cool. I really didn't like that when you did that. But this idea of coerced consent is such a tricky one that unfortunately we see playing out in the courts and things as well, where, for example, survivors will say their boss promised them a promotion if they had sex with them. And then the survivor did have sex with the boss, and then the boss didn't give the promotion. And then society's like, rah, rah, how could you do that? it's all your fault. Like, what did you think would happen? When in reality, actually, that's coercive consent, because you consented to something thinking this would be the outcome. And when that wasn't the outcome, it means that what you consented to was not what happened. And I think that's very important. And that extent, I mean, that's a sort of transactional thing. And I think that's what sex workers deal with a lot, is that, they're promised a certain amount of money and they are consenting to a sexual act for this amount of money. And then when that's taken away, it's like, well, what did you expect? You still had sex with the person for money. But actually, no, they had, they were raped or they experienced sexual violence because they were promised a certain amount of money and that was taken away. And so what they consented to didn't happen. Something else did. In this case, because it's sexual, it would count as sexual violence and rape. And exactly what you said about, if you don't give me a blowjob, then I'm going to sulk or I'm not talking to you. It's coercive, and it doesn't count as enthusiastic consent. And I think it boils down to, do you want to do that thing? Are you excited about doing that thing? And I think most of us know what that feels like, is when you do want to do something sexual with your partner or with somebody. And if you are feeling uncomfortable, to honor that feeling, like, what is that about? But I think a lot of people take things like marriage or long-term relationships as implied consent, and it's actually not. Yeah, you are consenting to maybe a relationship with a person, but not, having sex whenever they feel like it.
Now, I want to be very clear here, because this podcast is about rape and sexual violence. When I say that it's important for people to understand the difference between real and coerced consent within relationships, I'm not for a minute saying that every person who has ever had sex with their partner to keep them happy should be laying a charge of rape against them. That's not the point. What I am saying, and what I think Ronel beautifully gets across, is that if this is regularly happening within your relationship, then maybe you need to think about why that's happening and what it means for you as a human being. If coerced consent is a regular part of your day-to-day life, is that relationship really serving you? And why do you feel the need to acquiesce? For me, it's really about starting that internal conversation, either with yourself or with your partner, but most importantly, yourself. And acknowledging that it's not okay. And maybe it's not criminal, or maybe it is, but regardless, it should not be normalized. And I know that that's going to make a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. And I'm okay with that. Because let's face it, as much as we've made many great strides in our country, we are still very much bound to the ideals that have been passed down to us.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think you're so right. I think as much as we have this very progressive, policies and constitution, we're still a very conservative country, and especially religiously. And you do get that, if you are getting married, then what did you expect was going to happen? And that's the importance of saying that, as much as the law might say all these wonderful things, it needs to be a social shift and a cultural shift in our understanding of what consent means before the law can actually have any chutzpah behind it, if I can put it that way. Because until people can genuinely for themselves say, actually, husband, I wasn't cool with that made me really uncomfortable. The law is not, people are not going to come forward. They're not going to want to report. Never mind come for counseling or come for, chat to their friends about it. I mean, even though it's like one of those harmful old jokes that we still make is like she had a headache again last night, or, I just told him I had a headache. It's like, it's not really funny if you think about it, because it is a lot about like, you're having to give a reason for not wanting to have sex that isn't true. Like you're having to, it's not negotiated at all, or it's not communicated like, actually, I just don't feel like it, or something. It's like you have to give a reason that's beyond your control, like a headache. And that's very messed up, and it's very old-fashioned.
I also want to get this across. Just because we frame this as a husband-wife thing, it's not just that. This is not a female empowerment idea. This is a human empowerment idea. This is a way for us to rethink the way we interact with the human beings we claim to love the most in our lives, and to reconsider what our responsibility to those people and ourselves is. Feeling uncomfortable yet? Fabulous. Get uncomfortable. Get thinking and get talking so that we can stop teaching young women and young men that they in any way own the consent of another person. And more importantly, so that we can stop telling ourselves that. So why is this conversation, amongst others, important to have in the context of fighting against the scourge of rape and sexual violence? Well, because the more we talk about these things, these very simple dynamics within our relationships, the more we give other people permission to start to understand that what is happening to them is not okay. And that snowballs and starts to erode at our societal approach to rape and sexual violence in general. And it will give your grandchild's grandchild, in however many generations, the power to stand up and say, I'm not okay with this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's so well put, because I think, it's the weirdest thing. I'm sure you probably get this as well in your line of work, but whenever someone sees where I work, or they might see my email address or something, all of a sudden people start telling you stories, and they might not be, rape stories, they might be sexual violence stories, or on that spectrum. It's that simple. It's like if you can normalize a lot of these feelings around, sexual encounters and uncomfortable sexual encounters and around sexual violence, people can start having that vocabulary for themselves and working it out for themselves without thinking they are crazy or overreacting, or, the reality as well is that in South Africa, and I think in a lot of places, most survivors know their perpetrator in some way, shape, or form. So it is a lot more complicated than this person raped me, send them to Pollsmoor. It's like this person might be someone you were close to who you wouldn't really want to go to prison, or this person might be close to, might be a family member who, is held in high esteem, who you maybe don't really want, you don't think you'll get the support, or, the relationship between survivors and perpetrators is much more complicated than I demand justice via the prison system. And I think that we don't take that into account often. And when survivors are hesitant about, sending their perpetrator to jail, immediately we're like, well, then it wasn't rape, or what happened to you wasn't serious. And that completely forgets how complicated I think human relationships are. And also just things like power dynamics, gender power dynamics, economic circumstances. We have a lot of survivors who come in who were maybe raped by a family member or by a husband, and they say, if this person goes to jail, there's no money, in my family. There's no one to support us. They're the primary breadwinner. So how can you tell me that I must now send this person to prison?
It's a complex issue. And the sooner we start to understand that, the sooner we can start breaking down these walls of silence. When someone experiences rape or sexual violence, that complexity eats away at them. There are so many conflicting thoughts that will enter a survivor's head to convince them that they somehow deserved or sought out the attack or allowed the attack to happen. And those thoughts come from all of us. They come from our desire to minimize the horror of what has happened so that we can feel better.
No, like, for example, when we have rape survivors who were maybe raped by someone who broke into their house or something, and then, the person held a gun to their head, or maybe didn't even hold a gun to their head, but threatened to kill them. They feel so guilty that they, quote unquote, let the person rape them instead of kill them. And it's bizarre. I mean, what other crime would we say to people, you hear it often. It's like, I wish I was murdered instead of being raped. And I think that's such a harmful thing, because it's telling women that, like, to be raped is the ultimate, it's an absolute death sentence. And, you're completely shamed, you're completely, broken beyond repair. And, like, imagine feeling guilty for, being raped and, letting somebody rape you instead of murder you. And that for me is always heartbreaking. It's like, why are we telling people that, being raped is worse than being dead?
Being raped is worse than being dead. Just let that sink in. Imagine thinking that you would be better off dead and raped than raped and alive. And then the converse is true. Okay, well, I'm alive, so maybe I should just be grateful.
I mean, a lot of the times it looks like they sort of think, like, I don't have to say anything, or I don't need to get help because, at least I didn't die, or he didn't threaten me with a gun. But then what happens is it seeps into every part of their life, and they are struggling to go to work, or they struggle with trauma or flashbacks or nightmares. And then it's like they sort of feel like, why am I still holding on to all of this? When the reality is it's an incredibly traumatic, horrific thing to happen to somebody. It doesn't matter what it looks like. And you deserve support or help, or, somebody to just hold that space for you and hold that pain with you a little bit. But so many people feel like they're not worthy of the support or of the belief. And I mean, I think it's because society tells survivors that.
Heading back to our consent conversation, I've recently been pondering the concept of consent under false pretenses. So the whole Tinder swindler idea, for instance, where someone presents themselves as someone they are not. Or even in cult-like situations, where a cult leader may have told a survivor something that's not true in order to get them to have sex with them. I wondered where that fits into the consent continuum.
When you agree to a sexual act or to a sexual relationship, you're agreeing to it based on sort of an understanding of who the person is, what they're going to do, and that's consent, is that I know the full picture, and based on my knowledge, I am deciding that, yes, this is something that I'm excited for or that I want to happen. So when significant parts of that are missing, it's absolute coercion, and and that happens all the time, and especially in South Africa, where people are desperate for work, or they are desperate to, change their circumstances. Then they might engage in behaviors that we see as being morally questionable. But the reality is that a lot of the time they're doing what they need to survive. And then when that's already happening, and then you also, you lied to them about what they were having sex for, the reasons they were having sex with you, or keeping quiet about something, it's wrong, and it's sexual violence. Like, for me, that it's black and white, that's sexual violence.
So, really, when someone tells you a story that is different to the truth, or makes you a promise that is not how things end up happening, because you're entering into that without the full details, you are having the act of giving consent taken away from you without you even knowing it. If you have to promise someone anything or tell a lie in order for the sex act to be agreed to, you do not have that person's consent. Yes is not consent when it's an answer to a question that has not been asked with all the information behind it. And again, I think it's really important to point out that this entire conversation is not about who can and cannot take criminal action for rape and sexual violence. It's about what violation means to you. Yes, this is a true crime podcast. And yes, we want the perpetrators of rape and sexual violence to be punished. But it's not the be-all and end-all for survivors. And it shouldn't be the only focus.
the law might say very many things about what rape and sexual violence is. And like I said, the law is very broad, and if it was being enacted as it says on paper, it would be beautiful. But the reality is also that there are legal definitions of rape, and there are social, personal, moral, religious definitions of rape as well. And so my sort of, fail safe is to be survivor centered. So for you, if what happened to you was sexual violence, maybe the law might not see it that way. But like I said earlier, you engaged in a sexual act under certain pretenses, and then that was all taken away, and it's perfectly valid for you to feel violated and to feel wronged and to feel like something criminal has happened to you, because it has, right? And I think that there's a sort of saying that rape has nothing to do with sex, and I find that quite damaging, because it's got everything to do with sex, in that sex is still this very taboo, socially moderated, religiously meaningful aspect of our lives. And when people use sex and weaponize sex to humiliate or to get things out of people, they are playing on all of those aspects, and they are relying on them to keep the silence of the survivor. So I'm not going to talk about what he did to me because, it's taboo to talk about sex, or what I did was maybe morally questionable, or things like that. And all of that is nonsense. Like I said, there's only one bad guy in the situation, and that's the rapist.
All of this can be really overwhelming if we allow ourselves to think about how often this happens and how many people are being violated on a daily basis. And whenever we talk about cases that involve rape and sexual violence, I often hear, how can I make a difference though? Well, sometimes you can make the biggest difference just by being the person that a survivor can go to.
Let yourself be that safe person for someone else. So, like how I also feel about it is that I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a police person. So, it takes nothing from me to give the survivor that I see in the counseling room the benefit of the doubt. So whatever they say to me, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're telling me the truth, and that was meaningful to them. And I wish that society would do similar things, because we're not saying, go and mob justice this person or anything like that. We're saying, let the survivor know that you are someone they can start with, that they can talk to, that they can hash out, what does this mean? Why is this still bothering me? Be the safe person for someone, and just give them the benefit of the doubt, because often they are telling the truth. Mostly they are. I think there's still this idea that, women are now, the post-Me Too world, women are now coming after men left, right, and center by accusing them of rape, as if it's that easy to do. I mean, the official stat, the latest one I saw, is that I think it's 8.6% of rape trials end in a conviction for rape. So that's like from the start, from opening the case to the end. And I mean, obviously, some people will be charged with things like GBV, or they'll be charged with, intent to do grievous bodily harm. But to get like the rape conviction, that number is so low. So you really have to, if someone's going to falsely accuse you of rape and get you to go to prison for the rest of your life, that's quite something,
In a post-Me Too world, people didn't necessarily decide to start making allegations. They didn't suddenly start making up stories of rape and sexual violence to fit in. The stories were always there. Campaigns like Me Too just gave people the permission to talk about it. You heard the stat that Ronel provided. Less than 10% of rape trials will end in a successful conviction. Now, there are many reasons behind that, but most people know that a rape trial is not in any way a happy event. It's long, drawn out, and emotionally taxing. So I'm going to put it out there and say that In 99.9% of rape and sexual violence allegations, why would anyone want to falsely accuse? Do false accusations happen? Absolutely. Are they common? Not at all. A topic that is really close to my heart is sexual and domestic violence against male victims. It's a subject that is so rarely spoken about and really not well understood. I asked Ronel about the male survivors that she sees coming through the Rape Crisis Centre.
We are seeing a lot more male rape survivors come in for counselling. And I see that as a good thing, because I think it doesn't mean that more men are being raped. It means that more men are feeling comfortable to come forward and get help. And so for me, that's a good thing, because it absolutely happens. And especially there's so many misconceptions about that, and that men can't really be raped, or that if, he must be gay or things like that. And especially, a lot of men are raped by other men as well, which is, is part of the stigma then as well. And I think, a lot of men, especially around like any sort of anal penetration, it's very shameful for people. And it's still something that people feel very stigmatized around. So they don't want to talk about that side of it either. But then also, if you see male rape survivors who were raped by women, a lot of the time the body responds to sort of sexual stimulation to protect itself. So a lot of male rape survivors will say, I got an erection when this was happening, so it must have meant that I wanted it. And that's not true. It's the body sort of responding to stimulation, and sometimes it doesn't know how to differentiate sometimes around, is this a safe, wanted experience? And I think, so there's a lot of this stigma around, what anal penetration means, about, maybe having an erection, but then also things about men don't get raped, and I mean, that was the case with that Bishop's, the Bishop's scandal with the female teacher. The comments were crazy. They were like, oh, well, she's hot, lucky boys, why are they complaining? She's so good looking, she's young, and it completely disregards how serious rape is on a person's life, and how traumatizing it can be, and how scary it can be as well. And that's why I think you mentioned it as well as Dion Wiggett's podcast, and his approach is so interesting, because he sort of like talks about these aspects of male rape, and that they are, it is misunderstood. It's sort of like, he makes fun of the fact that he's like, he's a gay man, and he's like, I don't know if that's because I was raped, and so he like sort of approaches it by answering the questions I think people don't want to say out loud that they are thinking. But it stigmatizes men, and it doesn't let them come forward. And I think, and especially of young boys, it's also a big thing around, it's, rapists or perpetrators are also looking for people that are vulnerable, and that's not just women. It's men, it's effeminate men, so gay men as well. There's a great quote by Professor Pumla, where she talks about it. It doesn't, it's always enacted against the feminine, and that doesn't mean woman. It means, not the hyper masculine. So it's against young boys as well, or school kids. It absolutely is happening.
The devastating impact that rape and sexual violence has on men and young boys cannot be ignored in this conversation. I personally know men who have experienced sexual abuse as children from male and female perpetrators. And some of that abuse was dressed up as high school boys having so-called sex with older women, teachers, etc. And those men live with that trauma. Even though at that time, in certain types of situations, they may believe that they had consented. A child of that age does not have the ability to fully consent and understand what they are agreeing to. As a result, if that trauma is not dealt with, they find it difficult to have healthy relationships. They may develop addictions to pornography or sex or substances. And another aspect of what Ronel said that I'd like to highlight is that the natural physical reaction to sexual stimuli, which can happen when a man is raped, is not limited to men. There are many female sexual violence survivors who also report experiencing a physical reaction to rape that they have no control over.
And just from like a trauma perspective, it's very normal, because when we are in situations that the brain perceives as sort of threatening and it goes into that, fight, flight or freeze mode, it sort of switches into primal survival mode instead of higher order cognitive thinking mode. And the survival mode is very much in the body. So the body is going to go, okay, well, you lubricate, the vagina must now lubricate because, it's being rubbed or things like that, or it's seeing an erect penis or whatever the case may be. So the body will respond in all sorts of ways. And it makes a lot of survivors feel like their rapes are not illegitimate. There's actually, on the other side, another thing that I hear a lot of in the counseling space is that survivors will say, he started raping me with his penis and then he lost his erection. And they sort of feel like, so now what? Like if the person didn't ejaculate or things like that. But a lot of rapists actually lose their erection, in the struggle, or maybe they realize what they're, who knows. But, and that's also when you see things like penetration with bottles, with weapons, with things like that, because there's this real rage around like the penis failing at its sexual weaponry. And that's a huge part of rape that nobody talks about. And I think it's because we have this idea about what it must look like. And I think it's also a big part, of survivors' experience is that, what does this still count? The person lost their erection, or they penetrated me with their fingers or with an object or things like that. And I actually hear that more than you'd think.
If there's one thing that you walk away with today, I hope it's that whether or not your experience fits a criminal definition of rape or sexual violence is absolutely negligible. You do not need to put someone behind bars for your experience and your trauma to be valid. For a survivor, and as someone perhaps supporting a survivor, don't link your healing to the justice system. That is secondary. Think about how you can start to heal from this, both physically and emotionally, as a completely separate journey to any criminal proceedings, whether or not you choose to go down that path. And this is the perspective with which the Rape Crisis Trust also approaches their survivor services.
One of the strategies that we adopt in the counseling room is that even if the survivor is going through the rape trial process, their recovery cannot depend on the outcome of the trial, because the trial, there's so much there that we can't control, and that's contingent on all sorts of external things. So if survivors are thinking, okay, if he gets convicted, then I'm going to be okay, it's not a good thing, because we try to work on that, and like how can we make your recovery independent of what happens to your perpetrator? So many survivors also will come in and be like, the fucker died or something. Like now, they were really hoping that like they could maybe have their day in court, or maybe have the conversation with them, or tell them this is how you impacted their life, and then the person's dead, and then it's like, now what? So yeah, a big belief of mine is that recovery from rape is absolutely possible. It's very harmful to think that once you've been raped, you're basically dead, or there's no coming back for you, but it has to be independent of whatever the sort of criminal justice system does.
Can I just say, in amongst all of this bleakness, how cool Ronel Koekemoer is? I can see her going into battle for the survivors she counsels. And sometimes there's only one word that can accurately describe a rapist. The other problem with linking recovery to the criminal justice process is that really, it's never going to be enough. There is never going to be enough jail time to make right a rape. Ever. So if the survivor is looking to the criminal justice system for validation of the damage their crime caused, they will never get that.
Absolutely. Nicole, I hear that a lot around bail as well, where survivors will say, he got 250 Rand bail. Is that how much this costs? Like how much my rape costs, basically. Or also sometimes, especially with child rape, where maybe the parents might have been paid off to keep quiet about it. And then the adult survivor comes to us and they're sort of like, for my parents, what happened to me was 3,000 Rands. And like, it's difficult. It's hard. And it's, there's a lot of rage that goes into that, because we're trying to take a very complicated traumatic thing and put it into legal language and into sort of, criminological language as well. And it's messy, as people are.
A very good point that Ronel made about rape convictions and sentencing is that because our minimum sentences in South Africa for rape are relatively high, judges will always look for reasons that they should err on the side of caution in sentencing. So if something looks like a mitigating circumstance, they're far more likely to accept it as a reason to reduce sentence than in a murder trial, for instance. And that has the impact of sending a difficult message about what type of crime rape is. I think it's really important for us to know what steps to take in the event that you or someone you know experiences a rape or sexual violence.
Just so that people do know, so there's no statute of limitations on rape in South Africa. So you can report rape 20 years after it happened. And a lot of things that we hear is that people will say, well, if I report 20 years later, there's no DNA evidence, or there was no forensic exam done. And what I do want to say is people mustn't be put off by that, because just because they can prove that there was maybe, semen in the vagina, the defense often turns around and says, well, all that proves is that there was sex. It doesn't prove that it was rape. So it's DNA evidence isn't the solve all that I think people think it is as well. Immediately after being raped, if you do want to report it, or even if you just want, if you want that evidence for later, let's say, when you're ready, the important thing is to get some kind of help. And that might mean going to something called a Tutuzela Care Center or a forensic unit. And those are sort of specialized sexual offenses, one-stop shops where you can get access to a medical exam, to crisis counseling. They will activate the criminal justice system process. They will do the sort of, take blood. And then they also give people post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV exposure and, the morning after pill or things like that. But the medications fall within, a small window of time. But for survivors, it's important to get medical attention, just because you never know what if your perpetrator has, infected you with something or anything like that, or, if you're pregnant or things like that. But I think the most, and obviously that also means that's where you hear things like don't shower, put your clothing that you were wearing, bring it with to the hospital and things like that. And I think the other thing that I think is important is that if you do report the rape and you make a statement to the police, don't lie. And what I mean is not about the rape. I mean, if you were maybe smoking weed, or, you were flirting with the person or whatever, put that in your statement, because, flirting with somebody is not a crime. But what happens often is survivors feel they've got to be this perfect survivor and this perfect person. So then they leave things out. And then when the defense lawyer comes for them, they're like, well, why did you lie about, wearing a skirt or whatever the case may be? So to also just know that, your your experience is valid, even if you were doing silly things, questionable things that you weren't supposed to. What happened to you is what is the thing that's wrong. It's not your behavior that is the crime.
So, some important points that Ronel raised there. There are 55 Thuthuzela care centres in South Africa. You can access the location of these centres by going to www.gov.za/TCC. If you don't have a TCC in your area, head to your nearest hospital emergency room or clinic and they will guide you to the closest forensic facility. I cannot stress enough how important it is that rape or sexual violence survivors get themselves medical care. Even if you don't want to report the crime, that is an entirely separate issue. And if you're an adult of major age, no one can force you to report. But the long-term emotional trauma of a sexual violence incident is bad enough. You do not also want to be living with the added physical trauma, such as an STD or an unwanted pregnancy. And this is something we need to guide our friends, sisters, and brothers into. If someone reports to you that they've been raped, please help them to understand the importance of this step. I think that the Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust is doing phenomenal work. I asked Ronel how we can contribute to the work that they're doing if we so wished.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously donating funds is always first prize. You know, we have a mechanism for that, but also I think things like, you know, share the contact details, you know, let the survivors in your life know that there's places they can go, that there are safe people, that they can start somewhere.
Ronel also provided me with some amazing resources that I'll be linking in the show notes and on social media. So keep an eye out for those. I'd like to thank Ronel Koekemoer for taking the time to chat to me about this really important topic. I hope that our conversation has got you thinking, provided you with a point of view or a piece of information you didn't have before, or even just made you think more about the topic of rape and sexual violence. As much as it's not a pleasant topic to have to discuss, if we are really serious about stemming the tide of rape and sexual violence in this country, we have to have these types of conversations with each other and with ourselves. If you only ever share one episode of True Crime South Africa with your friends and family, please make it this one. Thank you for listening to my interview with Ronel Koekemoer, Counselling Coordinator at the Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show on the platform you're using to listen right now. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'll be back next Friday with another episode. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.